The autumn of 1917 in Paris was shrouded in a gray that seemed to seep into the very stones of the city. In the courtyard of Saint-Lazare prison, the air was damp with the breath of the Seine, drifting slow and steady between the iron bars. Footsteps echoed along the flagstones, measured and unhurried. The rattle of a key, turning in its lock, was the only sound that dared to break the morning stillness. And there, walking with a grace untouched by the rough hands of time or judgment, was a tall woman, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the enclosing walls. My friends, wherever you are listening, perhaps in a quiet room, a train at dusk, or under soft lamplight, share your place in time and subscribe to join our circle. Here we keep the memory of lives lived in shadow and in light, passing them from voice to ear, across years and oceans, as if we were a single long memory. The courtyard of Saint-Lazare was neither large nor grand, and yet on that morning it seemed to stretch into infinity. The damp stones held the night's chill. Each breath that rose into the fog felt older than the day itself. The figure walking across them did not hurry. Her steps were even, as though they followed some private rhythm, and her gaze was not for the soldiers who watched her, nor for the women at the windows, but for something that lay past the walls, past the river, past the war itself. But the story is not made of that morning alone. It winds backward to another place, another kind of air, fresher, colder, and filled with the smell of peat, smoke. It is in a small Dutch town in the year 1876, on a day when the rain was light but steady, making the cobblestones shine like polished slate. Inside a narrow house with a painted door, a child named Margaretha Geertruida Zell was born. The walls of her home held the scent of waxed wood and clean linen, the kitchen sometimes warm with the smell of spiced bread. Her father, Adam, was a man who liked the look of fine things, a gold watch, a good coat, a lively horse, and he liked to imagine his children would be dressed in the world's finest clothes. Her mother, Antje, was quieter, her beauty touched by a kind of fragility, the kind that makes people lower their voices in the room. In those early years, Margaretha lived as though in the warmest corner of a safe harbor. She was the eldest, the one who walked between her mother's skirts when strangers came, who clung to her father's hand when they crossed the square. Her days were made of small sounds, the ticking of the clock, the slow turning of pages as her mother read to her, the creak of the front door each evening when her father returned. Yet even in that harbor, there were shadows she could not name. She would later say she had learned early to watch people closely, not for their words, but for the way their eyes moved when they were thinking of something they could not say. It was perhaps then that she began to understand the subtle art of waiting, of letting silence speak. One afternoon, when she was perhaps 7 years old, she stood in the narrow street outside a shop. The glass of the window was speckled with rain, and behind it, in a row of painted toys, stood a small wooden horse, white with a black mane. She had stopped as though the sight of it had caught her mid-breath. She leaned forward, her nose almost to the glass, and the faint reflection of her own face wavered there. Small, framed by the brim of her hat, her eyes fixed on the thing she wanted but did not touch. Inside the shop, the lamps were lit early against the gloom, and she could just make out the shopkeeper moving between shelves. The smell of wet earth and coal smoke hung in the air. She stayed there a long moment, her breath making a pale mist on the glass. Somewhere behind her, carriage wheels rattled over the stones, splashing through shallow puddles. When she turned away at last, the reflection in the glass vanished. She walked on, her boots tapping softly, and the rain fell without hurry, darkening the edges of her coat. There are moments that leave no grand mark upon history, yet they fold themselves deep into the fabric of a life. That afternoon at the shop window was such a moment. The child who could stand so still, so long watching and not pressing forward, would grow into a woman who understood how to hold an audience with nothing but the turn of her head, the lift of her eyes. In those years, her father's fortunes still seemed solid. The family dined well, traveled sometimes, and Margareta knew the thrill of riding in a carriage past rows of houses, watching the faces of passers-by turn to look. But wealth, like a candle left in a draught, can gutter without warning. The hints came slowly. A creditor's letter tucked away, a conversation that ended when the children entered the room, the way her father sometimes stared at the fire without moving. Her mother's health was delicate, and there were days when the curtain stayed drawn and the house felt hushed. Margareta would sit at the end of the bed, her hands folded, watching the faint rise and fall of the quilt. She did not yet know that quiet can be a kind of forewarning. And then, one day, the warning became truth. Her father left, not for a trip, not for a day's business, but with the air of a man stepping into a road from which he would not return. Margareta stood at the window, her forehead just above the sill, and watched him walk away. The rain was falling again, softer now, but steady. His hat brim dripped in slow rhythm as he passed under the lamplight, his coat collar turned high against the damp. She could not see his face. The street was empty when he turned the corner. The sound of his steps faded into the rain. She stood there a long while, though the glass had begun to mist with her breath, until the cold reached her fingers. When she stepped back from the window, the room seemed larger and quieter, as if some shape in it had been erased. That image, a man walking away into rain, his back turned, would remain with her always. And perhaps, in the years to come, when she herself stepped onto ships or trains, she would remember the way distance can swallow a figure without haste, without drama, until there is nothing left but the sound of the weather. It is here, in this stillness and this quiet loss, that her life begins to turn, though she could not yet know the direction. The child at the shop window, the girl at the rain-dimmed glass, they both waited for something they could not name, and that waiting would shape her, as surely as the stones of her street were shaped by years of falling rain. The rain did not stop that day. It carried into the night, tapping on the roof, trickling down the gutters, a sound she could hear even in dreams. Somewhere far away, beyond the edges of her small world, trains moved along their tracks, ships cut through dark water, and cities lit their lamps against the deepening dark. And perhaps, in the quiet of her narrow bed, she turned her face to the wall and imagined places where no one knew her name. The rain that slid from the brim of his hat that day did not fall swiftly, but in long, deliberate drops, as if the sky itself were reluctant to let go. Each one landed with a soft tap upon the cobbles, vanishing into the shallow rivulets that wound their way toward the gutters. She stood at the window, watching until the shadow of his coat was swallowed by the curve of the street, until even the memory of his footsteps was replaced by the softer rhythm of water on stone. It was the kind of parting that leaves no final word, only an empty space that cannot be filled. In the months that followed, the house seemed to grow larger in a way that was not comforting. Rooms once filled with the sound of conversation now carried only the sigh of the wind slipping between window frames. Margareta's mother moved more slowly, her eyes often distant, her voice quieter still. The furniture, polished and proper, began to seem like strangers holding their place out of habit. Meals became simpler, served with less ceremony. There was an awareness, even for a young girl, that something had shifted and would not return. When her mother could no longer keep the household together, arrangements were made for Margareta to be sent away. The decision was spoken of in hushed tones, as if giving it too much voice might make it heavier. And so she left, the journey beginning with a carriage ride along familiar streets that seemed different without her father's presence. She kept her face turned toward the window, tracing the lines of roofs against the pale morning sky. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a freshness that seemed at odds with the knot in her chest. Her destination was a boarding school, an institution of dark wooden desks and high ceilings, where the smell of chalk dust mingled with the faint tang of iron from the radiators. The headmistress was a woman whose posture spoke of rules before her voice did. Margarita was given a uniform, her hair tied neatly, and shown to a narrow bed in a room shared with other girls. The sounds of their breathing at night became a kind of unchosen lullaby. Days at the school moved with the precision of clock hands. Lessons began at the ringing of a bell. Meals were taken at long tables where conversation was measured, and voices seldom rose above a murmur. There was comfort, perhaps, in the predictability, but there was also a restlessness growing in her. The uniform seemed to diminish her, to hide the girl who had once paused before shop windows and imagined other worlds. In the classroom, the air was dry, the light filtering in through tall windows that caught dust motes in its beams. She learned her lessons: arithmetic, history, French. But more than that, she learned to observe. She watched the way one teacher's mouth tightened when speaking of certain subjects, the way another's hand trembled slightly when writing on the board. She learned which girls whispered to each other after lights out, which ones folded their letters home with care, and which crumpled them without reading. It was here, in this confined world, that the first real hint of scandal touched her life. She was 15, perhaps a little older, and there were whispers, not loud, not shouted, but murmured like a draft slipping through the cracks. A certain lesson with a certain teacher, a closeness that was noticed and not forgiven. The details were never written down. The truth, if there was one, belonged to the shadows of memory. Yet the effect was immediate. The headmistress's voice was colder, her instructions more curt. The girls in the dormitory stopped speaking when Margarita entered. One morning, without ceremony, she was told she would not be returning to class. Her belongings, a small trunk, a few dresses, her hairbrush, were gathered, and she was placed on a train bound for home. The motion of the carriage swayed her gently from side to side. The fields passing by were still dusted with frost, the sky pale as unpolished glass. She watched the landscape slide away, the thin smoke from distant chimneys drawn upward into the still air. Home, however, was no longer the home she remembered. Her mother's health had worsened, and soon after she passed away. The house felt emptier still, as though its walls had been hollowed by silence. There was no father to steady the household, no mother to offer warmth. Margarita's younger siblings were scattered among relatives, and she herself was left to the care of guardians who saw her more as responsibility than as child. The years that followed were without the soft edges of childhood. She moved between households, never long enough to let her roots take hold, always aware of her place as a guest rather than a member. The polite smiles of strangers, the careful tones of conversation, the subtle exclusion from certain gatherings, all of it taught her the language of distance. And yet she carried with her an instinct, a certain resilience, the ability to adapt her manner to suit the room she entered. She learned that silence could be as commanding as speech, that a glance could carry more than a paragraph of explanation. These were not lessons taught in any schoolroom, but they would shape her far more than any book. It was during one such stay in a relative's home that she first encountered the idea of elsewhere in a way that felt tangible. A guest, an older woman with a deep laugh and a fondness for travel, spoke of far-off places, of markets in the Indies where the air shimmered with heat, of ships that smelled of tar and salt, of music that sounded nothing like the waltzes of Europe. The words lodged in Margarita's mind like a seed, and she began to picture herself in those scenes, not as an observer, but as someone who belonged to that wider, richer world. Her own world, for the moment, remained confined to small Dutch towns and the steady, narrow rhythm of daily life. Yet the thought of escape, not in the sense of running from, but in the sense of moving toward, began to grow. It was not yet a plan, not even a clear desire, but rather a quiet awareness that there was more, and that she might someday step into it. That awareness stayed with her through the winter. On long evenings, when the oil lamps cast their yellow glow and the wind pressed against the shutters, she would sit by the window and watch the snow fall. The flakes drifted slowly, catching the lamplight before vanishing into the darkness. She would imagine them as ships on a dark sea, each one carrying someone from one world to another. It was a private imagining, a small comfort against the weight of uncertainty, for she was still, at that time, very much a girl in need of direction, without the means to choose it for herself. She had no knowledge of the paths ahead, of the choices that would one day make her name known in cities far from the one where she was born. All she knew was the sound of snow on the roof, the faint crackle of the lamp, and the taste of longing, as delicate and persistent as the winter air. And in that longing, there was something else, a patience. The same patience she had shown as a child at the shop window, the patience to stand still until the right moment arrived. Perhaps she understood even then that the doors which truly change a life rarely open to those who pound upon them, but to those who stand quietly, listening for the latch to lift. The snow fell through the night, and by morning the town lay under a pale and fragile silence. She rose, dressed, and went to the window. Outside, the world was transformed. Every roof, every branch, every stone softened by the same white veil. She pressed her palm to the glass, feeling the faint chill, and wondered, not for the first time, how it would feel to wake in a place where everything was unfamiliar, where even the air spoke a different language. It would be some years yet before that moment came, but it would come, as surely as the snow would melt, as surely as the rivers would flow again to the sea. The slow drip from the brim of the hat was gone now, replaced in her memory by the slow curl of steam that rose from beneath the wheels of a winter train. She stood on the platform, the air carrying the mingled scents of coal smoke and damp wool, the chatter of voices muffled by scarves. Her gloved hands clutched the handle of a small suitcase, its leather worn smooth at the corners, its brass fittings dulled with age. The train waited, its windows glowing faintly in the pale light, the breath of its great iron body rising into the frost-bound sky. She had been sent once more to a place that was not home. It was another school, though this one carried itself with a sharper edge, more rigid even than the last. The headmaster was a tall man whose shoes shone to a mirror finish, his voice even but carrying the weight of command. The building itself seemed to frown at the world. High stone walls, narrow windows, a courtyard that echoed each step like a reminder that nothing here went unnoticed. Inside, the air smelled of ink and varnished wood. Long rows of desks bore the carved initials of past students, as though each had tried to leave some fragment of themselves behind. Margaretha was given a place among the older girls, her hair braided tight, her posture corrected with a firm hand if she slouched even slightly. Lessons filled the days, their rhythm unbroken save for meals and the rare hour in the yard. It might have been a quiet, unremarkable chapter in her life, had it not been for a series of glances and conversations that drew the wrong kind of notice. The details were blurred even then, as if wrapped in fog. A drawing lesson where the teacher's hand lingered too long in guiding hers. A moment in the corridor where their voices dropped lower than necessary, a look exchanged when others were not watching. Whether these things carried the weight of truth or the invention of restless minds, the effect was the same. Whispers gathered in corners, blooming like frost on a window pane. She found herself called to the headmaster's office, where the air felt colder than the rest of the building, despite the fire in the grate. Words were spoken with care, some edged with accusation, others dressed in the language of propriety. She listened, eyes lowered, knowing there was little she could say that would change what had already been decided in other rooms. The decision came swiftly. She was to leave. There would be no formal dismissal, no public scene, but her place at the school was no longer hers. The journey away from that place was taken in the deep of winter. She sat by the train window, the world outside reduced to a blur of white fields and black tree trunks. Frost formed delicate patterns on the glass, so fine they seemed almost alive, shifting with each breath of the wind. The warmth from the carriage stove could not quite drive away the cold that seeped in at the edges, settling into her bones. She thought of home, though home was no longer what it had once been. Her mother's absence was a wound that no amount of polite conversation or well-meaning relatives could close. The houses she returned to were not hers. She lived in rooms already shaped by other lives, her presence tolerated but never fully woven into the fabric of the household. She was learning, without meaning to, the art of belonging just enough to be left in peace. Her guardian spoke of arranging something more permanent for her, though their tones suggested practicality rather than affection. She was of an age where decisions about her future could be made without her consent, and she began to see that the narrow choices before her were not the ones she would have chosen for herself. Yet there was little rebellion in her. Not the loud kind, at least. Instead, she began to carry herself with a reserve that could pass for compliance, even as her mind wandered to other horizons. It was during one of these in-between years, neither child nor fully grown, that she began to hear more stories of the wider world. Visitors to the household spoke of journeys that began on ships, of cities where the air shimmered with heat and the nights were alive with music. One evening, she listened as a guest described the Dutch East Indies, the markets thick with the scent of spices, the bright fabrics hung from stalls, the soft rush of waves on shores lined with palm trees. The way the woman spoke, it was not merely a place, but an entire dream given shape. Margaretha stored these images in her mind, turning them over like stones in a pocket. The life she knew was narrow, predictable, and bound by the smallness of the towns she moved through. But she began to feel, in some quiet and unspoken way, that the road ahead would not always be so contained. In the meantime, she continued to play her part in the world she inhabited. She was polite at the table, attentive to her elders, careful not to give cause for further whispers. Yet behind her eyes, there was a growing distance, as though she was watching her own life from the other side of a glass. She learned the value of waiting, not merely for the sake of patience, but because the right moment, once it came, would demand everything. The winter deepened. Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, blanketing the streets until they lay hushed under its weight. She would sit by the window in the evenings, the oil lamp casting a soft circle of light around her, and watch the snow drift past. Somewhere in that drifting, she imagined the steam of a far-off train curling into the sky, a train that would carry her not back to a place she had known, but forward into something yet unseen. For now, though, the train she had taken brought her only back to the same, small world. She stepped down from the carriage, her boots meeting the icy platform with a hollow sound. The steam from the engine rose and swirled, catching the light before dissolving into the cold air. She paused, her breath misting before her, and for a moment she felt as though she stood between two worlds, the one she had always known, and another, just out of reach, waiting for her to find the courage to step into it. It was not yet time, but the steam, like a soft, curling promise, lingered in her mind long after the train had gone. The steam faded, as if carried away on a wind warmer than any she had known, and in its place rose the heavy, slow-moving air of the tropics. It wrapped itself around the skin like damp cloth, carrying with it the scent of salt from the nearby sea and the resinous sweetness of trees she could not yet name. The Dutch East Indies were a world apart from the narrow streets and muted skies of the Netherlands, a place where the sun did not merely shine but pressed itself upon you, where the nights hummed with the ceaseless drone of insects and the distant cries of unseen birds. She had arrived as the young wife of Captain Rudolph MacLeod, a man with a soldier's posture and a sun-reddened face that bore the lines of long days in uniform. Their meeting had been sudden and the courtship short, but for a girl whose life had offered few paths forward, marriage had seemed like the only ship that might carry her toward the horizons she had imagined. The voyage itself was a slow transformation. Weeks at sea, the air growing heavier, the stars changing their positions in the sky, the water shifting from gray to the deepest blue she had ever seen. The house they were given stood with its back to the jungle and its face toward the sea. Wide verandas wrapped around it, their boards bleached pale by the sun, and the shutters were painted the color of weathered leaves. Servants moved quietly through its rooms, the sound of bare feet on polished floors like a whisper at the edge of hearing. She had expected adventure, perhaps even romance, but what she found was a life contained within the walls of the house, bound by the routines of the colonial class and the rank her husband carried. The days were long, the hours marked not by clocks but by the changing quality of light. Morning began with the low golden glow that seeped in through the shutters, carrying with it the smell of coffee and the faint spice of clove cigarettes. By midday, the sun lay across every surface, and the air became so heavy it seemed to slow the very movement of thought. Afternoon storms would gather on the horizon, rolling in with a sound like distant drums, releasing sudden torrents that hammered the roof and turned the garden paths into shallow streams. At night, the lamps drew moths in frantic spirals, and somewhere beyond the edges of the garden came the slow, deliberate calls of frogs. The air never cooled entirely. Even in the dark, it clung to the skin, making the sheets feel almost damp. She would lie awake listening to the far-off crash of waves and the rustle of palm fronds, feeling as if the world here was always half asleep and half dreaming. Yet beneath that dreamlike surface, there was another current, one of unease. Rudolph was a man easily moved to anger, his voice sharp, his silences heavier still. There were days when the house seemed to hold its breath, when the servants avoided certain rooms, when she kept to the far veranda to avoid the sound of his footsteps. Words could wound in a place so far from home, and wounds left by words have nowhere to go. Her escape, when it came, was not in leaving, but in learning. In the village beyond the house, she encountered women who moved with a grace unlike anything she had seen. Slow, deliberate gestures that seemed to draw shapes in the air, accompanied by the soft, insistent rhythm of gamelan music. The first time she watched them dance, it was as though the air itself had changed weight. Their hands unfurled like the opening of flowers, their feet pressed into the earth with quiet certainty. She returned again and again to watch, and in time, she began to learn. The movements were not only a performance but a language, each gesture carrying meaning, each shift of the eyes telling a part of the story. The fabrics she wore when dancing were unlike her European dresses. Silk batiks patterned in colors deep as the forest, the scent of the cloth carrying the faint trace of the dyes. When she moved, she could feel the air cling and release, the coolness of stone under her bare feet, the subtle give of earth after rain. This, she understood, was not merely entertainment, it was ritual, memory, and art bound together, and it stirred in her something she had not felt in years, the sensation of being fully present in her own body. The dances spoke of gods and lovers, of battles and reunions, of journeys made across both land and spirit. She could not have explained why it mattered to her, only that it did. In the shadow of this beauty, life with Rudolph grew more strained. Illness came into the house like an uninvited guest and refused to leave. The climate wore on the body. Fevers rose and fell, and medicines offered more promise than relief. Their son fell sick, and though he recovered, the memory of his fragile breath in the humid night stayed with her. Later, their younger child, a daughter, would not survive. In the stillness that followed, the air seemed thicker, the days slower. Grief, in such heat, becomes a heavy garment one cannot take off. And yet, life pressed forward. The military world offered her no role beyond that of wife, and she found herself, more often than not, alone with her thoughts. She would stand on the veranda in the late hours, watching the fireflies drift through the garden like sparks from an unseen flame, and think of the girl who had once stood at a shop window in the rain. That girl had imagined other worlds, but she had not known how heavy they could be. Her marriage began to fracture under the weight of distance, not the physical miles between places, but the greater distance that forms when two people carry their grief differently. Words were exchanged that could not be taken back. Silences deepened into walls. She thought sometimes of leaving, though to leave here would mean returning to a country that had never felt entirely hers. One night, the moon was bright enough to cast clear shadows across the veranda floor. The music from a village celebration drifted faintly through the warm air. The slow, hypnotic clang of bronze, the high, trembling notes of a flute. She stepped out into the garden barefoot, the stones cool beneath her feet, and stood still in the moonlight. The air smelled of jasmine and wet earth. Somewhere in the dark, a single drumbeat began, slow and steady, and without thinking, she let her hands rise into the first gesture of the dance she had learned. For a moment, the world narrowed to the curve of her fingers, the turn of her wrist, the silent measure of her steps. In that space there was no husband, no loss, no distance, only the quiet truth of movement and the memory of all she had seen and felt. When the music faded into the night, she remained still, the moonlight cool against her face, the stone pressing gently into the soles of her feet. She turned and walked back toward the house, her shadow long and thin across the veranda boards. The nights in the Indies had their own kind of silence, thick but not empty, like the pause between heartbeats. It was in such a silence that she began to understand she would not stay here forever. The moonlight lingered in her mind long after that night, but in time, even its silver calm could not soften the weight of days. The garden's perfume of jasmine gave way in memory to the sharper scent of salt and tar as the ship that carried her away from the Indies moved slowly out of harbor. The boards beneath her feet hummed faintly with the steady labor of the engines. Overhead, gulls wheeled against a sky too bright to look at for long. She did not watch the shore until it vanished. She had learned by then that some departures are less painful if one faces forward. Weeks at sea brought the gradual loosening of the tropics' grip. The air cooled, the colors of the water and sky lost their saturated weight. She arrived in Europe with a trunk of clothes unsuited to the season and a mind unmoored from any sense of home. She was no longer the girl who had left the Netherlands, and the life she had known before the Indies was a door that would not open again. Paris awaited, though at first it was not the Paris of champagne and whispers, but a city whose winters smelled of coal smoke and whose streets glistened under lamplight after rain. She found rooms in narrow buildings where the staircases twisted like question marks and the windows rattled in the wind. The city's sounds were a constant: the rumble of carts on cobblestones, the distant cry of a street seller, the clink of glasses from cafes where she could not yet afford to linger. But Paris, even to a stranger, was a stage, and every street a kind of prologue. She moved through it with an attentive stillness, observing the way light fell into the curved mirrors behind bar counters, the way people turned their heads just slightly when a beautiful woman passed, the subtle choreography of glances exchanged across cafe tables. In time, she began to imagine herself in the center of such scenes rather than at their edges. The reinvention began not all at once, but in the slow accumulation of choices: a dress in a deeper shade, a hat worn at a sharper angle, the careful cultivation of a story to offer when asked who she was. She became Mata Hari, a name that in Malay means eye of the day, the sun itself. It was not merely an alias, but a transformation, as if the very syllables could draw a curtain between the past and the present. Her performances began in small venues, spaces where the air was thick with the mingled smells of sweat, powder, and the faint metallic tang of stage lamps. At first, the audiences were curious but reserved, their applause polite. She danced in silks patterned with motifs she had carried back from the East, moving with the deliberate grace she had learned in the Indies, though she allowed herself to embroider the steps with gestures that were more invention than tradition. The stories she told about the origins of her dances, temple rituals, sacred rites, were as much a part of the performance as the movement itself. Whether they were believed mattered less than that they were repeated. There was a peculiar intimacy in performing. On stage, she felt the eyes of the audience as a single gaze, warm and heavy, like standing in sunlight after a long winter. She learned to play with that gaze, to draw it toward a gesture, to release it with the turn of a shoulder. Each performance was both an offering and a negotiation, a balance between revealing and withholding, between what she gave and what she allowed to be imagined. The city took notice. The invitations multiplied, and with them came opportunities. She danced for private gatherings in rooms lined with gilt mirrors, for theaters where the velvet seats glowed red in the gaslight. She found herself in photographs, her image reproduced in newspapers with captions that described her as a mysterious, oriental enchantress. The truth of her origins no longer mattered in these printed versions of herself. What mattered was that she embodied the fantasy her audience desired. And yet, for all the glitter and music, there were moments when she felt the edge of solitude press in. After the last curtain call, when the applause had faded and the theater emptied, she would sit in the small dressing room, removing the pins from her hair one by one. The air, still warm from the lights, seemed suddenly too still. The feathers and silks that minutes before had made her radiant lay in a heap on the chair, their magic gone the moment they left her skin. One night, after a particularly long performance, she found herself alone on the stage after the house had emptied. A single peacock feather from her costume had fallen to the dusty boards and lay there, catching the faintest glint from the footlights. She bent to pick it up, feeling the fine barbs catch against her fingers. In that small, quiet moment, it seemed to her that the feather was both a token of her triumph and a reminder of its fragility. She carried it back to her dressing room and set it on the table beside the mirror. Its iridescence shifted with the light as she moved about the room, washing her face, folding the silks, unhooking the earrings from her lobes. In the silence, she could almost hear the echo of the music, but softer now, as if it came from some distant place. Outside, Paris carried on. The rattle of carriages, the murmur of voices spilling from cafe doors, the occasional laugh cutting through the night air. She sat for a while at the table, the feather resting by her hand, and thought of the long path from the rain-dimmed streets of her childhood to this small, lamp-lit room. The journey had been neither straight nor gentle, and yet it had brought her here, to a place where she could be seen not as she was, but as she wished to be. Still, she understood something she would never say aloud, that the stage, for all its light, was also a kind of mask, and that behind it lay the same quiet self who had once stood perfectly still at a shop window, waiting for something unnamed. The feather caught the lamplight once more as she reached to turn down the wick. Its colors shimmered and then dulled as the flame sank lower. The room settled into shadow, the air still carrying the faint scent of powder and silk. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city was awake, but here, for this moment, there was only the dark, the silence, and the soft weight of the feather in her hand. The peacock feather lay against her palm a moment longer before she set it down, and in the quiet curve of its stem, she saw another line, another arc, the stroke of a quill across a page. In her mind, the fragile plume became the dark shaft of a pen, and the shimmering eye at its tip turned into the deliberate flourish of her name, written in ink. That was how she remembered signing her first contract that mattered, not merely a promise of a stage for the evening, but the assurance of a season's work, of nights when her name would appear in print before the gaslights even lit the streets. The paper had been thick, the ink smelling faintly of iron, and the man across the desk, a theater owner with a beard trimmed to a precise point, had smiled as if both of them knew this signature was less about the terms than about the faith it represented. She had dressed carefully for the meeting, her gloves spotless, her hat tilted just enough to suggest both elegance and independence. The sound of the pen scratching over the page seemed louder than the hum of the street below. With the contract came a new rhythm to her days. Rehearsals filled the afternoons, each one a quiet conversation between movement and music. The hall smelled faintly of dust and ricin, the light falling through high windows and angled bars. She would arrive early, not from impatience, but from a need to walk the stage alone before others filled it, to feel the boards under her shoes and listen to the way the room answered her steps. As the performances began, the world outside the theater took on a different hue. Paris was already a city that noticed its own reflection, but now she began to see her own image in it. Not in the glass of shop windows, but in the way people paused as she passed, in the subtle recognition in a waiter's eyes, in the way a stranger at a cafe table would turn ever so slightly to listen when she spoke. Fame was not a tidal wave. It was a rising tide that crept in quietly, lifting you without your noticing until the water lapped at the edges of every part of your life. On stage, she learned the pleasure of pacing herself. A performance was not a sprint, but a slow unfurling, each movement prepared for by stillness, each gesture carrying the weight of what came before it. She wore silks that caught the light and veils that softened her outline, the colors chosen not for authenticity, but for the dream they suggested. The audience leaned forward not only to see, but to imagine, and she understood how to give them just enough truth to keep the fiction alive. Afterward, in the reception rooms where champagne glasses chimed against one another and the air smelled of perfume and cigar smoke, she would speak of her supposed temple training, of dances learned under moonlight in hidden courtyards. The words came easily, embroidered with detail when her listeners seemed hungry for them, stripped bare when a touch of mystery would serve better. It was not lying, not exactly. It was storytelling. And she knew from long ago that truth is only one thread in the fabric of a story. Yet away from the light, she kept her own company. The gold earrings she wore for performances, heavy, warm against her skin, became a ritual in themselves. She would remove them slowly after each show, holding them for a moment before setting them down on the nightstand. The small, precise click as they met the wood was a sound she came to associate with the end of the day, a quiet punctuation to the hours of spectacle. Sometimes, as she sat in her rooms late at night, she thought of the stages as a series of islands she visited, each one bright, bounded by applause, but surrounded by the dark waters of solitude. Between them, she traveled in the quiet of her own thoughts, moving from one appearance to the next without ever quite finding a shore that could be called her own. One evening, she lingered longer than usual in the empty theater after the audience had gone. The stagehands moved about in the shadows, their footsteps soft against the boards, their low voices speaking of ordinary things. She stood at the edge of the stage, looking out over the rows of empty seats. The red velvet now deepened to almost black in the dim light. Without the audience, the theater seemed larger, as though the absence of eyes allowed the space to breathe differently. She imagined the seats filled again, the warm press of attention, the moment just before the first note of music. The anticipation was its own kind of intoxication, a pause where everything was still possible. That pause, she thought, was perhaps her true addiction, the edge of something about to happen, the breath held just before the leap. Outside, Paris had already folded itself into the night. The lamps along the boulevards glowed like patient sentinels, their light catching in the damp leaves of the plane trees. The city's hum was gentler now, the clatter of the day replaced by the soft roll of carriages and the occasional laughter spilling from a doorway. She walked home with her coat pulled close, the earrings in her pocket, feeling the faint weight of them against her side. In the privacy of her room, she placed them once more on the nightstand, the click sounding exactly as it always did. She lit a single candle, its flame swaying in the draft from the window, and sat beside it, her hands folded in her lap. The day's applause was already fading in her memory, the conversations already softening into half-heard echoes. There was a comfort in this return to stillness, though it was a comfort tinged with a certain fragility. She knew the world's gaze could shift as easily as a stage light, leaving her in shadow. But for now, the light was hers, and she would hold it as long as she could, moving through the nights with the same deliberate grace she had once learned under the slow, patient rhythms of another sky. The candle burned lower, the wax pooling at its base, and in the soft, warm glow she let her eyes rest on the earrings one last time before sleep. They gleamed faintly, like two small suns caught in the quiet darkness, and their presence beside her felt both like a promise and a warning. The soft click of the earrings against the wood seemed to echo long after the sound had gone, fading into a quieter rhythm. The slow breath of nights shared, not with applause, but with another presence in the room. These were evenings not framed by a stage or an audience, but by the subtle exchanges between lovers and patrons, where conversation moved in low tones and gestures held meanings as layered as her dances. Paris, in those years before the war, moved to a different kind of music after midnight. The streets narrowed into shadows between buildings, their windows glowing like half-closed eyes. Behind certain doors, reached by climbing staircases that smelled faintly of polished wood and fading perfume, she would find salons where the air was heavy with cigar smoke, the tables crowded with glasses of amber liquid, and voices rose only enough to let the nearest listener catch them. Here, uniforms mingled with evening coats, gold braid brushing against silk. The men who sought her company came from worlds as different as their intentions. Some were officers, their manners precise, but their eyes restless. Others were wealthy travelers who collected people the way they collected rare books. A few were men of politics, their words chosen with care, their questions designed to discover what she knew of the movements of others. She understood that her presence offered them more than beauty. It gave them the illusion of stepping beyond their own lives into something more rare, more dangerous, or perhaps more alive. She did not choose all of them. Some evenings, she would leave a gathering early, stepping out into the cool night with her coat collar turned up, walking home alone beneath the steady lamps of the boulevards. Other nights she lingered, listening to the murmur of confidences spoken in her ear, the warmth of a hand resting lightly on hers, the sound of a laugh that carried just enough carelessness to be an invitation. In those rooms, she was Mata Hari still, but a different shade of her stage self, softer in voice, slower in movement, drawing the eye not with silks and gold, but with the measured grace of listening, of tilting her head at just the right moment. She let men believe they were telling her secrets. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they were telling her the stories they most wished to be believed. She kept each one, folding it away in the same quiet place where she kept the unspoken parts of her own life. The city outside her windows was shifting. News traveled quickly in Paris, and the shadow of war was beginning to lengthen across conversations, even in the most glittering rooms. Officers who had once spoken of hunts and duels now spoke of troop movements, their fingers tracing invisible lines across the air. There was a sense that the golden hours were dimming, though no one could yet say how quickly or how far. One winter, she took a train north to meet a man whose letters had been both ardent and measured, as though he feared the weight of too much feeling on paper. The journey was long. The fields outside the window blanketed with snow that glowed faintly in the pale sun. She sat wrapped in a heavy coat, her breath fogging the glass, watching villages pass in brief clusters of rooftops. There was a certain stillness in traveling alone, the quiet hum of the carriage broken only by the occasional rush of steam when the train slowed. When she arrived, he was waiting on the platform, his uniform immaculate, his smile small but warm. They walked through the town, the snow crunching beneath their boots, their words slow to form in the cold air. That evening, over a meal lit by lamplight, they spoke of the war as if it were a distant thing, something that could be kept away by the simple act of ignoring it. But later, when his hand covered hers, there was a faint tremor in his touch, and she knew that even here it was not far. In the weeks that followed, she returned to Paris with the snow still in her mind, its way of softening everything, of covering the sharp edges of the world. The train journey back was quiet, the fields blurring past as the heat from the carriage stove seeped into her legs. She wondered, as she often did, how many such journeys she would take, each one ending in a parting that was neither final nor certain to be renewed. Her rooms welcomed her with their familiar scent of wood and faint perfume. She unpacked slowly, the letters from the trip placed in a small wooden box she kept in the back of a drawer. Outside, the city carried on, the carriages clattering over the cobblestones, the air already smelling faintly of spring rain. Yet in the midst of this life, there was an undercurrent, a quiet recognition that each new acquaintance, each evening spent in the company of uniforms and polished boots, carried the possibility of something more than companionship. The world was growing more watchful, and she, without quite deciding to, had learned to move in that watchfulness like a dancer through her steps, aware of every eye, every gesture, every unspoken question. One night, she sat in the corner of a warm cafe, the windows fogged from the breath of those inside. The street beyond was wet, the lamps casting long, trembling reflections across the pavement. She sipped her wine slowly, her gaze turned toward the door, waiting not for anyone in particular, but for the feeling, the one she recognized as the beginning of a story. It always came the same way, the moment when the ordinary light in the room shifted, when a presence entered and changed the air just enough to be felt. The door opened. A man stepped in, shaking the rain from his coat, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for something he had already decided he would find. Their eyes met briefly, not long enough to be a greeting, but long enough to open the possibility of one. She set her glass down carefully, the stem making a soft sound against the wood of the table, and waited. Some meetings are the work of chance, some the work of design, but in her life they often began the same way, with a single glance held a fraction longer than necessary, and the quiet knowledge that what followed might not be told the same way twice. And so she waited, as the rain slid down the glass beside her, distorting the lights of the street until they seemed to float like small, restless ghosts. The rain slid down the cafe window in restless lines, drawing the streetlights into soft, wavering shapes until their glow no longer belonged to any one lamp, but to the night itself. That blur, that slow dissolving of clear edges, stayed with her in the weeks that followed, and in time it changed form, from water on glass to the thick, unmoving fog of wartime Europe. The fog did not merely sit in the streets, it wound its way into voices, into letters, into the unspoken pauses between one question and the next. Paris had dimmed. The brightness of the boulevard still glimmered at night, but beneath it lay a tension, the kind that made people glance over their shoulders in doorways. Uniforms were more common now, their presence not only in the salons and cafes, but in the steady march along the avenues. Conversations tilted toward hushed tones, and a careless remark could make a room fall silent. For a woman like her, the stage still offered its island of light, but the air beyond the footlights had changed. Invitations still arrived, though now they sometimes came not from theater owners or patrons of the arts, but from men who spoke in the careful language of opportunity. They did not call it recruitment, not at first. It began with travel, with the suggestion of a meeting in another city, with the promise of payment for her trouble. One evening in the private corner of a restaurant where the wine was older than the war itself, a man whose name she never quite believed leaned forward across the table. His words were slow, almost casual, but their meaning was clear enough. She could be useful. Her movements between cities, her presence at gatherings, the way people spoke to her when they believed they were speaking only to beauty, all of these were channels through which information might flow. She listened without agreeing, without refusing. It was a kind of dance, this exchange, though its steps were sharper, its rhythm less forgiving. She left that night with the taste of dark wine still on her tongue, and the awareness that the world she had moved through so easily was no longer only hers. In Madrid, the winter air was dry and smelled faintly of dust and oranges. She stayed in a hotel whose corridors seemed too long for their height, the sound of her footsteps stretching out behind her. There, too, she met men who spoke in layered words, who let their sentences trail off before their meaning was complete. Sometimes they asked about troop movements, about officers whose names she had heard in passing. Sometimes they spoke of coded messages, though whether they were offering or warning she could not always tell. In these encounters, truth and invention became difficult to separate. A story told over wine in a warm room might shift in the cold of morning, becoming less certain, less whole. She began to understand that in this world the truth was often only what could be agreed upon in the moment, and what remained afterward was a matter of record only if someone had chosen to write it down. Still, she accepted certain invitations, not all, never all, but enough to keep her moving, to keep the doors from closing entirely. She told herself it was necessity, that the war had narrowed the possibilities for women like her, that the stage alone could no longer sustain the life she had built. And yet, there was another reason, one she did not speak aloud, the knowledge that to be in motion was safer than to be still. On a gray morning in The Hague, she walked along a canal whose surface mirrored the low clouds so perfectly it seemed like a second sky. The air smelled faintly of wet stone, the faint salt of the sea carried inland on the wind. A man in a dark coat walked beside her, speaking in a voice so even it seemed to leave no mark on the air. He handed her a small packet, sealed with red wax, and told her it was for someone in another city. She did not open it. That night, in the hotel room where she was staying, the packet lay on the desk beside her bed. The lamp's light fell across it, catching on the smooth surface of the seal. She thought of breaking it, of reading what was inside, but her hand remained still. Some things, she had learned, carried more danger in their knowing than in their keeping. The hours in that room passed slowly. The ticking of the small clock on the mantel seemed louder than it should have been, each second marked like a bead on a string. Beyond the drawn curtains, the city moved quietly, its voices muffled by the fog that had rolled in from the sea. She sat at the desk, her eyes fixed on the packet, the seal unbroken, the air in the room heavy with the scent of the lamp oil. When morning came, she placed the packet in her bag without a word and left for the station. The train platform smelled of coal and damp wool, and the fog was so thick that the engine's dark bulk seemed to rise out of nothing. She boarded without looking back, her seat by the window offering no view beyond the slow, shifting white that pressed against the glass. She thought, not for the first time, of how easily a life could vanish in such weather, how the outlines of a person, a building, even an entire city could dissolve until only the memory of them remained. In that thought, there was both a chill and a strange comfort. By the time she reached her destination, the fog had thinned, though the air still held its dampness. She delivered the packet as instructed, her words polite, her manner unhurried. The man who received it offered no thanks beyond a slight nod, and within moments the transaction was over, leaving her once more in the quiet corridors of a hotel, the door closing softly behind her. That evening she sat by the window of her room, watching the lamplight flicker on the wet pavement below. The day had been uneventful in its outward shape, yet it carried with it the weight of something unmeasured, the kind of day that seemed to vanish the moment it ended, yet lingered in the mind as a question without an answer. The fog returned during the night, pressing against the glass like a slow-moving tide. In its muffled stillness, she thought she could hear the faint, persistent ticking of a pocket watch in another room. Not hers, not even nearby, but somewhere in the building, steady and inescapable, counting out the seconds of a life she was no longer certain she entirely owned. The ticking of that unseen pocket watch wove itself into her dreams, steady and close, as if it were resting against her own skin. By morning, she could no longer say whether she had truly heard it through the walls or whether it had been only her mind's invention, the echo of too many meetings in too many rooms where time felt both urgent and suspended. That sound stayed with her long after she left the hotel, trailing her into the streets, where the frost on the cobblestones shone faintly in the pale light. The watch, real or imagined, became for her a kind of emblem of all the moments being measured in quiet secrecy, of decisions taken in other rooms, of conversations that would never be recorded in any official ledger. Coded messages began to thread their way into her life more directly now, though often they were concealed in the most ordinary forms. A postcard with an image of a cathedral, the spire taller than it should be, a letter whose words, once rearranged, spoke of things never mentioned outright. She became attuned to such signs, though she could not always say who had sent them or why they had chosen her to receive them. In Paris, an envelope left on her dressing table carried only a theater program inside, yet in the margin of one page, in ink barely darker than the print, a series of numbers lined up in neat formation. She stared at them for a long while that night, their meaning hovering just beyond her reach, like the half-remembered words of a song. The rumors grew alongside the codes. Some came to her directly, whispered with the urgency of confession by men who were themselves unsure of what they knew. Others reached her indirectly. A remark overheard in the corner of a cafe, a name mentioned twice in the same day by people who did not know each other. They formed no single coherent story, but rather a cloud of possibilities, shifting with each retelling. In The Hague, she met a man in a lobby whose marble floors reflected the light from tall windows so brightly she could see the shadow of every movement. He spoke her name as though testing its weight, then asked about places she had been months earlier, cities she had passed through without lingering. His eyes watched her closely as she answered, his expression polite but unreadable. Later, when she returned to her room, she found a letter waiting, unsealed, as if inviting her to read it without hesitation. Inside was nothing but a folded sheet of paper, blank on both sides. Such moments unsettled her, though she did not let them show. She had learned long ago that the appearance of calm was itself a kind of protection. Even when she felt the tension knotting in her chest, her voice remained smooth, her gestures unhurried. It was the same discipline she had mastered on stage, the ability to control what the audience saw, even if the truth beneath the performance was less composed. One night in Madrid, she sat in a dimly lit hotel bar, the scent of tobacco smoke and citrus peel drifting in the air. The man beside her, whose name she knew was not his own, leaned close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath as he spoke. His words were low, deliberate, each one chosen with care, and when he paused, it was not from hesitation, but from the certainty that she would fill the silence with her own thoughts. He spoke of someone they both knew, though not in the same way, and of a piece of information he believed she might carry. She listened, her gaze steady on the glass in her hand, watching the amber liquid shift and catch the light. When he finished, she asked a question that neither confirmed nor denied her knowledge. It was the kind of reply that could pass as an answer, but left nothing for him to hold. Back in her room, she sat at the small writing desk, the hotel's stationery before her. The pen felt heavier than usual in her hand. She began to write a letter that would look, to anyone else, like a note of thanks for an evening's company. But between its lines ran another current, the kind that could be read only by someone who knew where to look. She folded it neatly, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it with a press of her thumb. The days moved like that, layered and uncertain, each one carrying the shadow of what had been said or implied the night before. She began to feel the pull of two currents at once, the outward flow of her life as Mata Hari, performer and hostess, and the undercurrent of a quieter existence where meaning was hidden, where the smallest choice, to open an envelope or leave it sealed, could shift the path ahead. It was the sealed ones that stayed with her longest. On a gray afternoon in Paris, she received an envelope of thick paper, its flap pressed closed with plain wax. She turned it over in her hands, the weight of it light but insistent. There was no return address, no marking at all beyond her name, written in a hand she did not recognize. She placed it on the mantel and left it there, untouched, as if by not breaking the seal, she could keep its contents from becoming real. The days passed, and the envelope remained where it was, gathering a faint film of dust. Sometimes she would glance at it while passing through the room, the way one might glance at a painting they did not wish to study too closely. It began to seem less like an object and more like a presence, quiet but persistent, holding something just out of reach. One evening, as the last of the light faded from the windows, she sat before the mantel, the fire low in the grate. She took the envelope in her hand, feeling the texture of the paper under her fingers, the faint give of the seal. The urge to open it came and went in waves, but each time she set it back down, telling herself that whatever it contained could wait. And so it remained sealed, its secret intact, the truth of it suspended between possibility and fact. In that suspension, there was a strange kind of safety, a space where nothing could yet be lost or betrayed. Outside, the city's lamps flickered on, their light pooling on the wet streets. She stood at the window for a long time, the envelope still resting on the mantel behind her, and watched as the reflections of those lamps wavered in the shallow puddles along the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck the hour, its chime rolling through the night air until it faded into silence. The envelope stayed unopened on the mantel, its pale surface gathering the faint shadow of the firelight until it seemed part of the room itself. And yet, it was there on the morning when the knock came, firm and deliberate, at the door of her suite in the Hotel Plaza Athénée. The hotel's corridors had been hushed that day, the carpet swallowing the sound of footsteps, the air carrying the faint fragrance of polish and lilies from the lobby. She had been fastening the clasp of a bracelet when the knock came again. Not hurried, not tentative, but with the steady weight of purpose. She opened the door to find two men in dark coats standing close enough that the colder air of the hallway slid into the room. Their eyes, polite but fixed, moved past her to the space behind, taking in the arrangement of the chairs, the folded shawl on the armrest, the small table where the envelope still rested in plain sight. They spoke her name with the kind of formality that belongs to official business, and without invitation, stepped inside. The arrest itself was quiet. There was no raising of voices, no scene to draw the attention of the guests in the rooms nearby. One of the men removed a folded paper from his coat and read from it in a voice that was almost even, though certain words seemed to carry more weight: suspicion, security, foreign power. She listened without interruption, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. When the reading was done, they gestured for her to take her coat, and she moved to do so without haste. The streets outside were damp from a night's rain, their stones darkened to a near blackness. The car that waited at the curb smelled faintly of leather and smoke. As they drove, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes tracing the lines of the buildings as they passed, the glimmer of lamps still burning in the morning mist. It was a part of Paris she knew well, yet it looked different now, as though a thin film lay over every surface, muting its colors. At the Ministry of War, the corridors were long and without ornament, the kind of spaces built to make footsteps echo. She was led into a room where the curtains were drawn halfway, the light falling across the table in pale strips. The man who awaited her there had a stack of papers at his elbow, his spectacles resting low on the bridge of his nose. He greeted her without warmth, motioning for her to sit opposite him. The questions began slowly, almost conversationally. Her movements between cities, the people she had met, the reason for certain journeys taken in recent months. She answered with care, the timbre of her voice even, her hands still on the table before her. At times she allowed herself to pause before replying, as though weighing the precision of each word. But the tone shifted. The questions began to press closer to certain names, to places where her presence was difficult to explain without entering the territory of her private life. She could feel the room tightening, not in temperature, but in the space between each exchange. She recognized the tactic. She had seen it in other settings, where an audience is drawn closer not by what is shown, but by the deliberate withholding of it. When they mentioned the envelope, her gaze did not falter. She told them truthfully that it had remained unopened, though whether they believed her was something she could not read in their faces. They noted her answer without comment, the scratch of the pen on paper filling the silence that followed. Hours passed in that measured rhythm, questions, pauses, the faint shuffle of pages being turned. Occasionally, the light in the room shifted as the clouds outside moved, the pale stripes across the table lengthening and then contracting again. At no point did she raise her voice. At no point did they. It was not a confrontation in the loud sense, but rather an unbroken narrowing of the ground on which she stood. By the time they rose from the table, the day had darkened. She was escorted not back to the hotel, but to a cell, small with stone walls that held the day's chill, the faint scent of dampness clinging to the air. There was a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a pitcher of water. The door closed with a sound that was more final in its quiet than any shout could have been. She sat for a long time without moving, her hands folded in her lap as they had been in the car, the muffled sounds from elsewhere in the building. A door opening, the creak of a hinge, the distant murmur of voices came and went like currents in water. Somewhere above she could hear the faint roll of carriage wheels passing in the street, their sound swallowed quickly by the thickness of the walls. On the small table in the corner stood a single candle, its wax pooled unevenly at the base. She lit it with a match taken from the pocket of her coat, the flame trembling for a moment before steadying. The light pushed back the shadows only as far as the first lines of mortar between the stones, beyond which the room remained in its own quiet dusk. She thought of the mantel in the hotel, of the envelope still lying there. It was not the paper itself she missed, but the space it had occupied. That half-known presence, suspended in meaning, waiting to be either opened or left untouched. Here in the cell there was no such choice. The candle burned with a faint hiss, as if reminding her of its own passing. She sat beside it, the warmth from its flame barely reaching her fingers, and watched the wax slide slowly down its side. When the door opened again and the guard entered to collect her for further questioning, the candle's light caught on the metal of the keys at his belt, flashing briefly before vanishing into shadow. And with that small, fleeting glint, the day's quiet interrogation was not over, but only paused, its unanswered questions still hanging in the air between them. The glint of the guard's keys was still in her mind when she was led into a different kind of room, one where the air did not carry the damp chill of stone, but the faint scent of polished wood and old paper. The candle's flame in her memory seemed to quiver here, transformed into the pale, steady light that fell through the high windows of the courtroom. The sound inside was unlike the muffled quiet of her cell. It was a space that gathered every movement, every whisper, and sent it upward into the cavern of its ceiling. She entered without hurrying, her steps slow on the worn boards. The benches to either side were filled with spectators, their faces turned toward her with the avid stillness of people who have come not only to witness, but to decide for themselves what they believe. Some she recognized, journalists with notebooks poised, men and women whose names had crossed her path in other settings. Others were strangers, their eyes reflecting not recognition, but curiosity sharpened by the promise of a scandal. She took her place at the table reserved for the accused, her hands resting lightly before her. The prosecutor began, his voice measured but with an undercurrent of satisfaction, as though the weight of the assembled evidence was already leaning in his favor. One by one, he called witnesses. Men who spoke of meetings in other cities, women who claimed to have overheard fragments of conversation, officials who recited the contents of reports in tones that made them sound indisputable. She listened. Sometimes she met the speaker's eyes. Sometimes she let her gaze rest elsewhere, on the polished edge of the bench before her, on the way the light from the windows caught the dust in the air. There were moments when the accounts did not align, when the dates or places blurred against each other. Yet the words were like drops of water falling into a basin. One by one, they accumulated, and the shape they began to form was not one she recognized as herself. When it was her turn to speak, she did so without raising her voice. She recounted her travels, her performances, the reasons she had accepted certain invitations. She denied the charges in plain language, neither pleading nor protesting. The courtroom listened, though she could feel in the air that her voice was not the only thing shaping their thoughts. The stories told before hers had already taken root. The judges asked their questions in turn. Some were direct. Where had she been on a particular day? What had she carried with her? Others were broader, framed in a way that seemed designed to invite interpretation rather than fact. She answered each with the same deliberate care, choosing her words as though they were steps on a path whose edges were hidden in shadow. From her place at the table, she could see the gallery clearly. A woman in the third row leaned forward slightly, her gloved hands clasped together. A man near the back tapped his pen against the edge of his notebook without writing. The air was thick with a kind of listening that went beyond hearing. The way people listen when they are searching for confirmation of what they already suspect. The hours stretched, the light in the room shifting gradually from morning's pale gold to the softer haze of afternoon. Once or twice the court paused, the judges retiring briefly before returning. Each time the murmur of voices in the gallery swelled and then quieted again, like the tide rolling in and out. By the time the final witness spoke, the air in the courtroom felt heavier. His voice was steady, his words confident, and as he spoke, she realized he was describing her not as she saw herself, nor as she had been, but as an idea, a figure shaped from the fragments of fact and rumor alike. It was as though he were painting a portrait in which certain colors had been chosen not for their truth, but for the effect they created when placed together. When the last word was spoken, the gavel struck the bench with a sound that echoed upward, striking the air beneath the high ceiling before returning to settle in the stillness of the room. It was not yet the end, but the pause before the next turn of the proceedings. She was led out through a side door, the murmur of the gallery fading behind her. The corridor beyond was cool, the sound of her footsteps accompanied only by the faint rustle of the guard's coat beside her. They passed tall windows through which the afternoon light fell in long, narrow strips, each one lying across the floor like a step she was meant to take. Back in her cell, the walls felt closer than they had that morning, though nothing in their shape had changed. The air still held the faint scent of damp stone. The bed still stood in its place against the wall. The small table still waited in the corner. But the day's words had followed her here, filling the space as invisibly and as completely as the cold. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap, and closed her eyes for a moment. The murmur of the courtroom was still in her ears, the faces of the spectators still before her. She thought of the candle she had lit the night before, of its small, steady flame, and how easily a shift in the air could make it waver. When the guard returned to bring her evening meal, the sound of the key turning in the lock was sharp against the thick silence. She glanced toward it, the image of the gavel's fall still fresh in her mind. Outside the narrow window, the light had already begun to fade, and the first hint of evening's chill was pressing in. The door closed again, and the room settled back into stillness. Somewhere in the building, a hinge creaked, and a voice spoke briefly before being lost to the distance. She sat in the dimness, letting the echoes fade, until only the memory of that final hollow gavel strike remained. The hollow gavel strike still seemed to shiver in the air long after she had been returned to her cell, as though the sound had seeped into the stones themselves. In the stillness that followed, the hours took on a different weight, stretching thin and slow, marked not by bells or clocks, but by the shifting of the light across the walls. Morning light was pale and unhurried, settling in a narrow strip that moved like the shadow of a slow tide. By midday it lay flat on the floor, warming the uneven surface of the stone. By evening it retreated altogether, leaving only the candle's faint circle. She learned to measure the passing of time not by minutes, but by these quiet transformations. There was a comfort, strange though it was, in knowing that the light would always come and always go, no matter the walls that held her in place. The prison air was dry and carried a faint metallic tang, as though it had passed through iron before reaching her. Even the sounds here moved differently. A cough from a cell down the corridor traveled slowly, the distant clink of keys arriving as if through water. She wrote letters when she could. At first, they were addressed to friends, their lines polite and careful, holding more form than feeling. Then came the ones for which there was no certain address, words to her daughter, written in the quiet hours before sleep, though she could not be sure they would reach her. She wrote of ordinary things, of memories that were safe to share, and sometimes of dreams in which they walked together through a market full of flowers. These pages she folded carefully, smoothing the creases as though that might keep the distance from widening. In the silence between writing and waiting, her thoughts drifted toward stages long gone. She would see them as if through gauze, the glow of footlights warming her skin, the soft sweep of silk over her ankles, the rising breath of the audience in that moment before the music began. She remembered how the air felt against her face when she stepped forward into the first gesture, the hush that followed as though the whole room had leaned in. Here, in the cell, those moments felt both impossibly far and close enough to touch. Sometimes she dreamed of them. The dreams were not precise. They blurred one performance into another, one costume into the next, until the dances themselves became a single, endless movement, flowing without beginning or end. When she woke, the faint scent of dust and damp stone was there to remind her of the distance between the stage and the narrow bed where she lay. The guards who brought her meals seldom spoke, but she learned their rhythms, the sound of their steps, the way the key would pause a moment in the lock before turning. Once, as she reached for the tray, her fingers brushed the rough cuff of a coat sleeve, and the guard's gaze met hers for a fraction of a second. It was neither sympathy nor suspicion, but something in between. An acknowledgement that they both inhabited this place, though not in the same way. The nights were the most measured time of all. In the quiet, every small sound was magnified, the drip of water somewhere far off, the faint creak of wood settling, the flutter of a moth against the candle flame. She would lie awake, listening to the city beyond the walls, the distant clatter of a carriage wheel, the muffled ring of a bell marking the hour. They came to her like fragments from another life, reminders that the world outside had not stopped moving. It was during one such night, when the air was still and the moonlight lay faint against the far wall, that she thought of her daughter again. The image rose so clearly that it felt almost present. The curve of a cheek, the quick turn of a head, the sound of laughter carried on the air. She reached for it, knowing even as she did that it would fade with the coming of day. Morning brought with it the soft metallic scrape she had come to expect, the turning of a key, the quiet swing of the door on its hinges. The guard stood there, his hand still on the frame, his expression unreadable. In his other hand, the faint glint of iron caught the candlelight before vanishing into shadow. The sound of that turning key seemed to carry more weight than usual, as if it had been struck from the same metal as the gavel in the courtroom. She rose without speaking, smoothing the skirt of her dress with both hands. The cold of the floor seeped through her shoes as she crossed to the door. Outside, the corridor was dim, the only light coming from a small, high window at the far end, its glass mottled and uneven. She walked toward it, the guard's steps steady beside her, the faint jangle of the keys marking each movement forward. What awaited her beyond the corridor, she did not yet know. But in that moment, as her shadow moved ahead of her along the worn stone, she felt the air shift in the same way it had on the mornings before a performance. That quiet moment when the curtain is still drawn and all the world seems to pause on the edge of beginning. The key turned in the lock with its usual unhurried scrape, but when the door opened, the figure who stepped inside was not the guard with the morning tray. It was her lawyer, his coat damp at the shoulders from a fine rain, the brim of his hat still holding a few drops that slid down and fell silently to the floor. He removed it as he entered, his manner both formal and faintly weary, as though the corridors themselves had taken some of his strength before he reached her. She gestured to the single chair in the room, but he remained standing for a moment, looking at her in the measured way of a man deciding how much to say before the words even begin. Then he sat, placing his hat carefully on the table between them, his fingers resting lightly on its brim. He spoke first of the appeal. It had been lodged, the arguments prepared, the papers filed with the proper weight of language. There was still a chance, he said, slim but present. His voice did not rise or fall with hope or doubt. It stayed level, carrying only the facts as they stood. She listened, her eyes steady on his, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She had learned over the years that people often gave away more in the spaces between their sentences than in the sentences themselves. As he spoke, the rain outside deepened, the sound of it threading its way through the thick walls in a faint, uneven rhythm. She found herself listening to it almost as closely as to him, as though the two sounds, the measured words and the soft tapping of water, belonged to the same unbroken piece of music. When he finished with the facts, he shifted to the questions he needed to ask her again. They were not new. She had answered them in other rooms, before other listeners. Where had she been on certain days? Who had she met? What had been said, and by whom? She answered each as she always had, without hurry, without embellishment. The truth, as she told it, did not change with repetition, and yet she knew that truth alone was not the currency by which this matter would be decided. There was a moment when the questions were done, when neither of them spoke. He sat with his hands clasped, his gaze lowered to the hat on the table. She watched the way his thumb moved absently over the brim, tracing the faint line where the felt had been pressed smooth by use. In that small movement she read what his voice had not said, that the appeal was more form than faith, more duty than promise. Still, they spoke for a while longer, of things that had nothing to do with papers or judges. He told her of the city in small, precise details, the blossoms beginning to show along the edges of the gardens despite the chill, the way the shopkeepers were arranging their windows for the season, the pigeons gathering in the square near the Palais Royal. She listened as though each detail were a thread tying her, however lightly, to the world beyond the walls. When at last he rose to go, she walked with him to the door. The guard waited there, his expression unreadable, his hand already on the ring of keys. Her lawyer placed his hat on his head, the movement deliberate, and for a moment his eyes met hers in the space before formality closed over them both again. The door shut. The key turned, and the room seemed immediately smaller, the air heavier. She crossed back to the chair and sat, her gaze drawn to the faint trail of water the soles of his shoes had left on the floor. The marks darkened the stone, a pattern already beginning to fade as the dampness sank in. She watched until they were gone, until the floor looked as it always did, unmarked, unaltered, as though no one had come. Outside the narrow window, the rain had eased, leaving the air washed clean but still heavy with the scent of it. She could see a strip of the sky pale and unbroken, the color of paper before ink touches it. For a moment she imagined it as a canvas, waiting for something to be written. A message, a reprieve, some word from elsewhere that might yet alter the shape of what lay ahead. But the sky remained empty, the light moving slowly across it in the way it always did. The hours ahead would be measured as they had been measured before, by the shifting of that light, by the distant footsteps in the corridor, by the scrape of the key when it came again. She let her hands rest on the fabric of her skirt, tracing the seam absent-mindedly, the thread slightly raised under her fingers. The motion was small, almost without thought, but it grounded her in the present moment, a point of contact with something tangible, unchanging, when so much else had become uncertain. In the stillness, the memory of the rain returned, carrying with it the faint scent of the city streets, of wet stone and the faint metallic tang of the Seine. She closed her eyes and held it for as long as she could, until it, too, faded into the quiet of the room. Her fingers continued to trace the seam of her skirt, slow and without urgency, until the movement no longer belonged to the cloth beneath them, but to another time entirely. In her mind, the roughness of the thread gave way to the smooth glide of silk, warm from the lights above a stage, and the still air of her cell was replaced by the faint shimmering heat of lamps burning behind a curtain. She saw her own hands as they once were in performance, not idle, but alive with intention, each gesture deliberate, each angle of wrist and spread of fingers chosen as carefully as a word in a letter. She remembered how the movements from Java had first entered her body, not as mimicry, but as something she had learned to breathe into. The music was slow, a current that did not pull but invited, and the hands were its translators. In those dances, the fingers could tell of longing or refusal, of a greeting offered or a bond sealed. A turn of the wrist could be the opening of a flower or the closing of a door. The eyes could shift from earth to horizon in the space of a heartbeat, and the audience would follow. In the cell's quiet, she let herself rehearse them in memory. The slow curve, the pause, the return. She could almost feel the cool, polished boards of the stage beneath her bare feet, the faint gyve of them with each step. The air here might have smelled of stone and damp linen, but in her mind it carried the weight of incense, of pressed blossoms, of the faint tang of bronze from the gamelin. She remembered the way the stage lamps caught the edges of her costume, how they made the silk glow from within, as though it were lit by something more than light. The heat from those lamps would touch her skin in a thin veil, enough to draw a bead of moisture at the base of her neck. And when the audience leaned forward, the movement was almost imperceptible. A shift in the air, the smallest tremor, yet she could feel it like the tightening of a string. Those were the moments she danced for, not the applause that followed, but that fragile stillness in which the room seemed to hold its breath. In that space, she could be anyone she wished, could step into any story, and for a time, both she and the audience would believe it. Now, sitting in the narrow cell with her skirt under her fingertips, she realized how little it took to summon that feeling back. A shadow could become a curtain, a seam could become silk, the slow turn of her head could recall the arc of a spotlight. The body remembers what the mind tries to put away. It stores the shapes of movement like pressed flowers between the pages of a book. The sun shifted outside the window, casting a thin, barred shadow across her face. The lines lay sharp and unmoving at first, then softened as the light weakened toward evening. She sat still beneath them, as she might once have stood beneath a veil in the opening moments of a performance, letting the audience see her only in fragments before the reveal. The bars were real now, and so was the room. But the mind is not bound entirely by walls. She thought of the applause that would come at the end, how it was never only sound but a kind of wind moving toward her, touching her, sometimes lifting her for a moment above the weight of herself. It was the closest thing she had known to flight. And here, with only the scrape of the guard's boots in the corridor and the muted cry of a gull from the river beyond, she felt the absence of that wind like the absence of air itself. The hours folded into one another as the light faded. She did not rise, did not light the candle until the last trace of daylight had slipped from the wall. The small flame took its place, swaying faintly, painting the cell with shadows that moved as if in time with some hidden music. She watched them, half imagining they were the silhouettes of other dancers, the outlines of forms she had once moved among. It was only when the shadows lengthened to touch the far wall that she stood and stepped toward the window. Outside, the sunset had left a thin line of color on the horizon, a trace of rose dissolving into the deepening blue. The city beyond was already settling into its night. A few lamps flickering to life, the faint glow of windows far away, the dark roof lines resting against the sky. She turned back to the cell, the candlelight falling across the floor in shapes as shifting as the patterns on the fabrics she had once worn. For a moment she lifted her hands, letting them fall into the first position of a dance she knew by heart. Slowly she moved through the opening gestures, the arc of her wrists, the unfurling of her fingers, the pause before the next step. The silence in the cell seemed to hold her in the same way the silence of the audience once had, expectant and still. When she stopped, the air felt different. Not lighter, but clearer somehow, as though a window had been opened somewhere beyond the reach of her eyes. She returned to the chair, the candle still burning, the barred shadow now faint against the wall. At the far edge of her mind was the awareness that this moment, like the dances she remembered, would not last. The evening would come, and with it the sound of keys and the voice at the door. And when that came, she would rise, as she had always done, to meet whatever waited on the other side. For now, she let the last light of day fall where it would, her shadow stretching across the floor until it touched the bars and was broken by them. The shadow of the bars thinned and disappeared with the coming of dawn, replaced by the pale, even light that slipped through the high window. The cell was cool, the air holding that faint metallic tang of early morning, the kind that seems to belong to a world not yet fully awake. Somewhere down the corridor, a hinge groaned, followed by the slow, deliberate turning of a key. She sat very still, listening as the sound drew nearer. The steps of the guard unhurried but certain, until they stopped at her door. When it opened, the light from the corridor seemed warmer than the light in her cell, though it carried with it the hollow echo of a place not meant for comfort. The guard's voice was low, a single instruction, and she rose without asking what waited beyond. Her skirt brushed against her legs as she crossed the threshold, the air shifting slightly as the door closed behind her. They led her through passages she had not walked before, the walls painted in pale shades that caught the morning sun where the windows allowed it. The sound of their steps was different here, less muffled, more defined, as though each one carried its own small announcement. At the end of one corridor, another door opened, and with it came a change in the air, a faint scent of grass, the cool dampness of the world outside. The prison gate stood ahead, iron bars framed by heavy stone. Its hinges, when they moved, did so with the slow weight of something that had not been opened often. Beyond it lay a small courtyard, its ground uneven with patches of grass pushing through the cracks. Mist clung low to the earth, curling around the stones like something unwilling to let go of the night. She stepped forward, the mist parting around her feet. The guards moved to either side but did not touch her. Their presence was enough to guide her path. The air carried the faint sweetness of leaves beginning to turn, the sharper note of damp earth. Somewhere nearby, though she could not see it, water moved, the quiet rush of a river against its banks. She had dressed with care, though she had little to choose from. Her coat was fitted, the fabric still holding the memory of its original shape, her gloves smooth over her hands. The buttons were fastened all the way to her throat, not against cold, but in recognition of the day's formality. She walked as she always had in moments that mattered, not hurried, not hesitant, her steps measured to neither challenge nor yield. Around the edges of the courtyard, figures stood waiting. Some wore uniforms, their shoulders squared, their expression still. Others were there in the capacity of witnesses, their eyes following her with varying degrees of curiosity, solemnity, or something harder to name. She met none of their gazes directly, though she felt each one as distinctly as the weight of her own coat upon her shoulders. The mist was thicker near the far wall, drifting upward in small, loose curls. It blurred the outlines of the buildings beyond, softened the angles of the stones. Somewhere in that haze, a movement caught her attention. A slight shift, no more than the turn of a head or the adjustment of a stance. She recognized it not for its clarity, but for its rhythm. The world was full of such small signals, invisible to those who had never learned to read them. Her eyes lifted briefly to the pale sky, the color of porcelain cooled in shadow. The breath she drew in was deep and steady, filling her with air that seemed both sharper and lighter than the air of her cell. It was the kind of breath one takes before stepping onto a stage, before the music begins, not knowing the shape of what will follow, but certain of the need to meet it without falter. In that moment, she felt the faintest tremor beneath her feet, as though the earth itself had shifted its weight. It was nothing anyone else would have noticed. It could have been only the wind moving through the courtyard, the touch of the mist curling against her ankles. But to her, it was a signal, not of change, but of the thin line between one moment and the next, the place where past and future meet without touching. A voice called her name, low but distinct, and she turned her head toward it. The sound seemed to come from far away, though the man who spoke stood only a few steps beyond the line of guards. His eyes did not hold pity, nor did they hold judgment. They held something quieter, something that might have been respect, though of what kind she could not say. She continued forward, the mist yielding again around her. The grass beneath her shoes was damp, its blades bending under her weight. Somewhere nearby, a bird called once, the note brief and without echo, as if even it understood that this morning was not one to be filled with sound. When she reached the center of the courtyard, she paused. The air seemed stiller here, the mist less restless, as though waiting with the same patience as the figures who surrounded her. She could feel the weight of the moment, not as something crushing, but as a quiet insistence. The way the silence before the first gesture in a dance contains all that will follow. Her gloved hands rested at her sides, the seams of the fabric smooth under her fingers. The coat's weight was steady on her shoulders. The world beyond the courtyard's walls was invisible now, lost to the pale veil of mist, and in its absence, this small space became all there was. She looked once more toward the far wall, its outline faint, the stones blurred. The mist curled upward again, soft and unhurried, as though it had been here forever and would remain long after. She drew another breath, slower this time, and let it out without sound. Somewhere, unseen, a door closed. The sound was quiet, but it carried a final note before the stillness deepened again. The mist curled higher, thinning just enough for shapes to emerge, not the gentle outlines of trees or walls, but the darker, sharper forms of men standing in place. Their boots were set firmly on the damp ground, their coats heavy with the morning's moisture, the faint glint of metal at their sides dulled by the pale air. She walked forward without changing her pace, the sound of her steps softened by the grass, the hem of her coat brushing against her calves with each movement. The soldiers did not speak. They shifted only slightly, the small adjustments of men standing in formation, a tightening of grip on a rifle, the lift of a chin. The mist softened their edges, but the lines of discipline were still visible, the straightness of their backs, the symmetry of their stance. She had seen soldiers before, on parade grounds, in railway stations, in the far-off garrisons of the Indies, but never in a silence like this. She kept her gaze forward, though she was aware of every eye that followed her. The air between them felt suspended, neither warm nor cold, as though the day itself had stopped just short of committing to its own season. Somewhere beyond the courtyard's low wall, the city was waking, a distant cartwheel turning on cobblestone, the faint cry of a vendor carrying through the damp. Those sounds reached her as if from another time, another life, their ordinariness in quiet contrast to the stillness around her now. As she moved, fragments of other mornings returned unbidden. The smell of tropical fruit just cut open on a veranda, the sound of rain on tin roofs in a Dutch port, the warmth of Paris air after a summer night's rain. These memories did not come in order. They came like the mist itself, drifting in and out of shape, each one touching her briefly before fading back into the pale air. They brought with them no fear, not because there was none to be felt, but because fear had no place here. Not in this measured walk, not in the presence of these men whose faces were as composed as carved stone. What she carried instead was a quiet clarity, the same she had felt in the moments before stepping onto a stage when the curtain was still drawn and the music had not yet begun. It was the knowledge that she could choose how she met the moment, even if she could not choose the moment itself. Her thoughts turned to the night just past, the final hours she had been given. She had slept lightly, waking more than once to the faint shift of air against the window, to the sound of the guard steps passing by. Each time she opened her eyes, the darkness was different. Sometimes deep and unbroken, sometimes carrying the faintest gray of approaching dawn. She had risen before they came for her, dressing without haste, fastening each button with the same deliberate care she had once given to fastening her costumes. Now, in the mist, that care felt like a form of armor. Not one that could stop what was coming, but one that kept her from being entirely claimed by it. The weight of the coat on her shoulders was steady, the fit of her gloves exact, the narrowness of her shoes grounding her with each step. Even here, she could choose the shape she made in the eyes of others. The soldiers grew clearer as she neared, their outlines gaining weight and substance. The mist clung to the folds of their coats, silvering the dark wool, catching faintly on the barrels of their rifles. Their eyes did not waver. She wondered in a passing thought if they had been chosen for this duty or assigned to it without question. If they would remember her face tomorrow, or let it dissolve into the same pale distance that lay behind her now. One of them shifted slightly, the sound of his boot against the damp ground quick but not hurried. The movement was enough to remind her that all of this, the stillness, the silence, the way the mist seemed to hold its breath, was not a frozen image, but a moment moving toward its end. She drew in a breath, letting the coolness of it settle in her chest, then released it slowly. The air tasted faintly of earth and iron, of stone that had held the night's dampness. Her eyes lifted once more, not to meet the gaze of any one man, but to take in the pale space beyond them, where the mist thinned into something like open air. She imagined stepping into that space as one might step onto a stage flooded with light, the audience waiting but unseen. In that imagining, there was no fear, only a sense of crossing from one world into another, not forward or backward, but into a place where time itself did not move as it did here. She let the thought settle in her mind, held it as she might hold a final note in a dance, and carried it with her as the last few steps closed the space between herself and the waiting line. The mist shifted again, brushing cool against her cheek before curling away. Somewhere to her left, a bird's wing cut briefly through the air, the sound no louder than the whisper of fabric in motion. The soldiers remained still, but the weight in the courtyard had changed, as if something unseen had leaned closer. She knew this feeling, the pause before the first sound of music, before the curtain rose, before the story began to reveal itself, and though she did not know how many moments were left, she knew this one, and she stood in it fully, letting it belong to her as much as it belonged to them. Her gaze lifted toward the thinning veil, and for a breath the pale morning above the courtyard became another sky entirely, clean and high and blue as enamel, with the faintest milk-white wind brushing across it. In that other sky a kite was turning, not a proud machine of silk and bamboo, but a homemade diamond of paper and string, wobbling and then steadying as a pair of small hands learned how to feed the line and when to hold it fast. The grass beneath those hands was not slick with mist, but spring green and damp with thaw. And the voices that drifted across it were not the guarded commands of men, but the neighbors, calling to one another as they pegged laundry and shook rugs in the pale Dutch sun. She could feel again the pull in her palms, the tug that was both invitation and warning, and the sudden lift when the kite found a pocket of air and shot upward with a tremor that traveled straight through the thread into the heart. Freedom, someone had said that day, a word tossed into the air as lightly as a laugh. She had not known what shape it took, only that the kite seemed for a moment to carry it and return a share of it down the line to her. She watched the paper diamond tilt and flash, its simple tail scrawling the wind, while her father's voice told her to give more line, and her own breath counted the small jerks that meant it would climb if she was patient. The sky was unmarked by smoke, unbroken by the geometry of uniforms, and the wind moved as it pleased. When she closed her fingers a touch, the string bit into them deep enough to sting, and the sting was sweet, because the pull at the other end was a living thing that answered her without words. She kept it there in the center of her chest, that answering pull, through years that taught her how much of life is learned by the hands before the mind can name it. She kept it through classrooms where air tasted of chalk and varnish, through the hush of corridors and the thin light on ink-blotted pages, through the moment when the word impropriety bloomed like a bruise and she was put out into weather that offered nothing but the window's reflection. She kept it aboard a ship that rolled its long back to a different sun, and on verandas where the noonday heat turned breath to velvet, and in the slow bronze pulse of music, whose language had waited in the bones of the earth longer than her people had been counting years. She kept it in rooms where men spoke in measured voices and asked about what lay behind curtains, on trains where fields slid past in the winter hush, and windows feathered with frost, like wings about to remember their use. And now, standing among men whose faces were curved into that difficult stillness which is not quite resolve and not quite regret, she felt it once more, the pull, drawn taut between the body that stands and the air that moves as it must. She let the childhood afternoon open inside the morning courtyard, side by side like two panes of glass held together by the same frame, and she watched the kite climb until the spool grew light in her hands, and the line was as fine and clear as a river seen from high above. Freedom, they had said, but it had never been a door thrown wide. It was the art of feeling for the wind with a thread that could cut the skin and still be worth holding. The man who stood a little forward of the others, the one whose eyes carried neither pity nor triumph, shifted his weight as if to bring the present back into its appointed shape. She let it come. The kite steadied, at a height she could measure only by the way the string drew a straight path between small bones and the sky. And with that steadiness came the evenness of breath that had once belonged to the seconds just before music. She remembered how audiences waited at such times, the hush as palpable as cloth, their hearts arranging themselves unconsciously to the rhythm they were about to be given. She thought of the girl at the shop window, her mouth fogging the glass while rain beat a true beat on the street, and she thought of the woman in the Indies balanced on cool stone, while the moon measured the night in silver. And she thought of the hotel room where an envelope lay sealed, the promise of knowledge held back by the lightest skin of wax. She thought without bitterness and without claim of the face of a child she had not seen in years, the way a laugh can lift the air as surely as a kite's sudden rise, and she let that, too, settle in the order of this morning, a clear shape among the others. It is odd, she found herself thinking, how the body remembers how to be itself wherever it is placed. The feet know how to stand. The spine knows how to stack its segments like coins balanced edge to edge. The hands know how to be still until stillness ceases to be a waiting and becomes the thing itself. She had learned those lessons in other rooms, under other lights, and the price for them had varied, but they remained hers. Even now the coat lay correctly across her shoulders. The gloves matched her hands with the exactness of a held breath, and the hat brim, though the morning was quiet and the mist not yet rain, kept its line like a bowed head that does not give way. She could see past the vague gray of the far wall a strip of sky that would have been blue if the hour had chosen color for itself. Somewhere a cart rattled, and somewhere a door gave its hinge a single warning, and somewhere the river ran with the same unhurried insistence it had carried the night before. All of it was ordinary, which is to say most of what the world is. In that ordinariness lay her anchor. She had never belonged entirely to a single story, and if others had tried to bind her to one, the thread they used was rumor, which snaps when weather turns. What remains are the quiet things, the honest weights that teach a body how to stand. A breath came, and she took it, and another, and then another, each one opening a small, clear space in the chest and letting it close again without complaint. She measured the space like a dancer measures the stage without moving, by the angle of attention, by the slow adjustment of balance that says, I am here and will be here until the music tells me otherwise. Perhaps that word had always been a mistranslation. Not freedom, as in doors flung back and fields without fences, but the modest mastery of one's own breath in the presence of what cannot be changed, the keeping of one small instrument in tune while storms arrange themselves elsewhere. She thought this not as a philosophy, but as a fact. The way a seam is a fact and a knot is a fact, and a hand that ties the knot is neither enemy nor friend, but a hand that knows its work. She felt them come up behind her, one step and then another, their approach neither hurried nor cruel, and the air altered as bodies alter it, even when silent. The mist touched her cheek and slid away. She did not close her eyes. She had closed them on stages as an opening gesture and had opened them to the first swell of sound. She had closed them to remember a scent or a voice, and had opened them to save herself from the trap of remembering too long. Now she kept them steady, not as defiance, not as consent, but as the last plain thing that belonged to her without having to be asked for or forgiven. Someone spoke a word, a low one meant for the men who needed its shape to finish their training, and near her left shoulder cloth stirred. She could feel the faint warmth of another's breath, the ghost of a human nearness that was almost kindness by the simple fact of being human. Then the fabric was raised and brought across her face. It smelled of starch and clean water, of a laundry room far away from soldiers and courtyards, of a woman's hands that had wrung and folded it with the same thoroughness with which she had wrung and folded 100 others. The world narrowed to that scent and to the weight of the cloth settling over brow and cheek, and then to the small adjustments as fingers found the back of her head and drew the ends across. The sound the fabric made was the tiniest susurration, the hiss of thread against thread. For an instant the sky was a brightness through weave, and then only a paler place in the dark. She felt the ends being gathered, the slight shift as they were crossed. The childhood kite drew one last clean line through the air and held there, a quiet angle between earth and blue. The breath she took now went in and came out as evenly as any that had preceded it. Behind her ear the fibers tightened carefully, not hurried, not delayed. And then, with the care of work done exactly as it must be done, came the small, irrevocable pull as the blindfold's knot was tightened. The knot settled against the base of her skull with a firmness that was neither harsh nor gentle, but final. The pressure was not sharp. It was a steady hand holding her in one place, as if to say that from here there would be no more turning of the head, no more looking beyond what was directly before her. The cloth warmed quickly from her skin, its weave a faint texture beneath the darkness, and the air within it held its own stillness, tinged with the faint scent of starch and something older, like linen that has waited too long in a cupboard. The silence deepened around her. It was not the quiet of absence, but the kind that arrives when many breaths are held at once, when every movement is weighed before it is made. In that stillness, the shape of the courtyard changed. She could no longer see the mist, the soldiers, the line of the wall. Yet she could feel where they were as surely as she could feel the ground beneath her. Sound became its own map. The faint scuff of a boot to her left, the shift of fabric as someone eased the weight on one foot, the muffled intake of breath from a man who had been standing too still for too long. The command did not come at once. Time stretched here, in this darkness that was not absolute, but was without horizon. The body marked it in its own ways, the heartbeat that began steady and then slowed, the breath that deepened not from calm but from necessity, the small gathering of muscles in the legs to hold her weight, without sway. She had learned to stand like this long ago, when stillness itself was part of the performance, when the first movement had to be earned by the patience of waiting. And so she waited now. Somewhere close, the sound of metal shifted. Not the loud ring of steel against steel, but the muted readiness of a mechanism settling into place. The air seemed to move with it, a slight stirring that carried no wind, only the sense of something inevitable approaching its moment. She could hear her own breath within the blindfold, could feel its warmth return to her cheek. In that closed world, her thoughts did not scatter. They turned inward with the slow precision of a dancer's measured step. Images came, not in sequence but in fragments. A stage lit in amber, the rustle of silk at her ankles, the faint sweetness of clove-scented air in the Indies, the tremble of a kite string in a child's hands. The people in these images did not speak. They moved or stood. They lifted a hand or turned a head. They occupied their moments without reaching for the next. Perhaps this was the truest form of stillness she had ever known. Not the poised calm of waiting for music, nor the restless hush before a verdict, but the kind where the present moment is both the entire stage and the curtain closing upon it. The command came then, low and clipped, not for her, but for those who faced her. It moved through the air like a thin line, crossing the space between voices and hands, settling into the bodies of the men who would answer it. The sound that followed was not loud, no roar, no crack to split the morning. But for an instant she heard the rush of breath and the faint shift of boots against damp ground. And then, for a heartbeat longer, nothing. That heartbeat was a world. In it, she could have been anywhere, on a veranda listening to rain, at the edge of a stage waiting for the cue, standing by a riverbank as the water moved past in its patient course. The air was cool within the cloth, her feet steady on the earth. She felt the shape of her own hands at her sides, the length of her spine holding her upright. When the sound came, it was not what she had imagined in all the quiet hours before. It was softer, almost muffled by the mist, each note of it folding into the others so quickly that it became one single stroke. It passed through the courtyard and into the walls, into the air, into the breath she had just taken. And then there was only the wind. Not a gust, not a sudden force, but the kind that moves through a space when something has just left it. It touched her coat, the edge of her sleeve, the curve of her cheek beneath the blindfold. It carried with it the faint scent of earth turned over, of stone newly struck by air. Somewhere beyond, a bird called once, a clear note that did not wait for an answer. The courtyard held the sound of the wind for a while, and then even that began to fade, leaving only the stillness again. The wind faded, carrying its last threads into the unseen corners of the courtyard, and what replaced it was not silence exactly, but a stillness so complete that even the smallest sound could take root. And then it came. The dry, unhurried whisper of paper turning, as if somewhere close by someone had opened an old book and set a finger to its edge. It was a sound she had heard in libraries and in rooms thick with the scent of dust and polished wood, the kind of sound that belongs to memory as much as to present time. In that turning of a page, the moment shifted, the air giving way to something longer, something made not of breath, but of years. The story of her life and of her death would not remain in the courtyard where it had ended. It would move into other hands, other voices, its shape altered with each retelling. In the months after, newspapers would carry her name across borders, printing it in type that seemed to grow bolder with each edition. Some spoke of her as a danger, a deceiver who had worn beauty as a weapon. Others cast her as a victim, a woman caught between forces larger than she could ever have commanded. Between these two portraits lay a gulf that no single truth could bridge. In the cafes of Paris, the talk continued long after the headlines had lost their urgency. A man in a corner seat would lean toward his companion, lowering his voice to share a detail no one else knew, though whether it had happened or not was a question neither seemed to ask. In drawing rooms, her name was spoken with a kind of practiced sigh, the syllables drawn out as though they alone carried the weight of the scandal. In quieter towns, far from the city, her story arrived in fragments. A headline cut from a paper, a photograph passed from hand to hand, a rumor carried by someone who claimed to have seen her perform years ago. The photographs became their own kind of truth. Some were posed, her gaze direct, her hands lifted in the opening of a dance. Others were blurred by motion, her features softened into an almost unfamiliar face. These images, printed and reprinted, were pinned to walls, tucked into drawers, slipped between the pages of books where they would be found years later, their edges browned and curling. And in the telling, the woman became less herself and more a figure made of suggestion, the glint of an earring in low light, the outline of a shoulder in silk, the curve of a hand offering a gesture no one could quite name. Her life was pressed into the shape of a legend, and in that shape, the contradictions became part of the design. Some claim to have known her well, a dancer in Berlin who remembered sharing a dressing room, a diplomat's wife who swore she had seen her in Madrid at a dinner where politics were spoken only in whispers. Each told their version with the certainty that memory often wears, though the dates and details rarely agreed. Others claimed to have been in the room when the verdict was read, or to have walked past the prison gates on the morning of her death. They described the mist, the stillness, the measured pace of her walk, all of it with such precision that one might believe they had been there, even if they had not. The truth, whatever it had been, became less important than the way the story was shaped in the telling. The gaps were filled not with fact, but with the colors that suited the teller, the deep red of betrayal, the soft gold of longing, the cool gray of inevitability. And as with all stories carried beyond their own time, the boundaries between what had been and what might have been grew thinner with each passing year. In archives, her name began to appear alongside the names of men whose lives had been measured by battles and treaties. Reports were filed, some marked in heavy black ink with the word confidential, others stamped as if their secrecy had already been decided before the first line was written. These papers, kept in drawers and locked cabinets, spoke in a language of dates and times, of coded messages and intercepted letters. Yet even there, between the official lines, the questions lingered. Outside those locked rooms, the story was told in other languages. In novels, she appeared thinly disguised, her dances described as if they were spells, her glances as if they could set the course of a war. In plays, she stepped onto stages lit in ways she had never known, wearing costumes imagined by those who had never seen her. In paintings, her face took on the features of the painter's own muse, her story adapted to fit the canvas. And still, in the quiet corners of certain conversations, she was remembered differently. By a woman who had once sold her a bolt of silk, by a man who had sat beside her on a train, by a musician who had played for her without ever looking up to see her face. These recollections were smaller, but they carried a weight the grander tales did not. They were not about the legend, but about the person. The way she had held the fabric in her hands, the sound of her voice asking the price, the way she had thanked the musician at the end of the evening. Yet even these fragments could not escape the pull of the larger myth. In time, they too were folded into it, their details softened or brightened until they matched the colors already chosen. The woman who had been flesh and voice and movement became an image fixed on paper, and then an idea, and then a story told to fill the space between one generation and the next. Somewhere, years later, in a quiet house far from Paris, a single photograph lay face down on a wooden table. Its edges were worn, its back marked only by the faint impression of the image it carried. It had been left there after an evening of sorting through papers, and for a time no one turned it over. The lamplight fell across its plain surface, the grain of the wood beneath it visible in the stillness. The window was open a little, and the night air moved softly through the room, carrying with it the scent of rain. Outside, the trees shifted their leaves in a sound like the brushing of silk. Somewhere in the distance, a page turned in another book, and the sound was almost, but not quite, the same as the one that had begun it all. At last, someone reached for the photograph. The fingertips that lifted it were careful, as though the paper might resist the change, as though turning it over might shift more than the image. The card slid lightly across the table, the faint rasp of its edge on the wood the only sound in the room, and then, face upward, she was there again, caught forever in a moment of mid-dance. Her arms were raised, the angle of her wrists both precise and fluid, the fingers unfurling as though they had just released something invisible to the eye. One knee bent, one foot resting lightly on the toes, her balance set in that poised in-between where movement has already begun, but has not yet declared its direction. The silks she wore seemed to sway in the captured stillness, their folds deepening in shadow and catching light at their edges. Her face was turned slightly to one side, the line of her jaw clear, the mouth neither smiling nor solemn, the eyes alight with something that could have been triumph or could have been a secret she never meant to share. The photograph had been taken from a low angle, so that the space behind her looked larger, the stage boards meeting the air like an open horizon. It was not a perfect image. There was a blur at the edge where another dancer might have moved just out of frame, a slight overexposure in the upper corner where the light had struck too directly. But in that imperfection lay its truth. She had never belonged entirely to the polished image that others tried to make of her. She had always been something slightly apart from the frame, something that slipped between the lines of description. The person holding the photograph leaned closer, as though proximity might reveal a detail the years had kept hidden. But there was nothing here that could be explained, no sign that told whether she had known the moment would be preserved, or whether she had simply been dancing and let the world take what it wished. The room where the photograph lay was nearly bare. A table, a chair, a narrow shelf with a few books leaning against each other. At the far end stood a small writing desk, its surface clear but for a single candle in a plain holder. The wick was unlit, the wax untouched, as if it had been waiting for an occasion. Outside, the evening had drawn itself over the world in deepening blue, the outlines of the buildings across the street softening as the first lamps began to bloom in their windows. The air through the open pane carried the faint hum of distant voices, the occasional rattle of a cart along the cobbles, and beneath it all, the quieter rhythm of a city settling toward night. The photograph was set back down, this time face up, its image catching the lamplight and holding it in the silver grains of its surface. It seemed to watch the room, to wait with the same patience that had been in her stance. The candle was lit at last, the match flaring briefly before the small flame steadied, its light spilling over the table in a warm oval. The air shifted with the heat, just enough to make the edges of the photograph quiver. In the moving glow, her eyes in the picture seemed almost to change, as though the dance might continue if one watched long enough. Shadows deepened in the folds of her costume, the silk appearing to move again, the moment not as fixed as it had seemed in the daylight. The flame bent slightly in the quiet draft from the window, then straightened, the light rising and falling in the soft rhythm of its own breath. No one spoke. The room needed no voice to name what it held. The photograph lay where it could be seen, the candle's light brushing it with each small motion of the flame. Outside, the night gathered itself in layers, the faint rustle of leaves, the muted chime of a clock somewhere far across the rooftops, the breath of wind that slipped in and passed through without staying. The books on the shelf leaned as they always had. The chair stood where it had been pushed back. The desk waited in its stillness. In that stillness, the candle burned without hurry, its wax softening, its light holding the room as gently as a hand might hold a bird. The photograph remained where it was, the woman within it poised forever in that single step, her arms lifted toward something unseen, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the limits of the frame. And when the match's scent had faded, when the air had settled again around the small, swaying flame, the room seemed to fold itself around the two quiet witnesses. The image on the table, and the light that made it visible. Beyond the glass, the city's lamps shone against the dark, each one a small, unwavering point, as if the night itself had decided to keep watch. The candle's flame moved once more, a slow, graceful bow to some invisible current, before lifting again to stand as it had before, steady and unbroken in the breath of the room.